Welcome back to another exciting episode of the Stablecoin podcast. I'm your host, Rami Solomon, co-founder of Stablecoin Partners and president at GMO Trust, along with my other co-founder, Luther Madej, who is not the Baron of Stablecoins, but he's the Baron of Payments. That's what we have at the moment. We have a very special episode today, actually, with the wonderful Beth Haddock, who is the policy leader at Stablecoin Standard. And I'm very happy to have this conversation around the wonderful policy work that has been done. So we can talk about past, present, where we're going, the initiatives, and Beth's journey. Before we start, the disclaimer: anything shared here by the hosts or the guests are purely our own opinions and not any reflection of the organizations that we work for. This podcast purely for educational purposes and entertainment purposes, and not to be taken as any investment or any other kind of advice. With that, Beth, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you. There's a lot to talk about. So I think maybe shall we start with your journey into digital assets and stablecoins and maybe Stablecoin Standard?
Thank you. Should I call you Sir Rami?
No.
That's how I refer to him nowadays. Yeah, it's Sir Rami.
Just for the podcast.
Just for the pod.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I do think potentially my journey is similar to other listeners in that I started in traditional finance a couple of decades. I was in charge of regulatory compliance. And then around 2016, I really felt like I needed to be part of a solution, sort of changing the paradigm for traditional finance and solve some of the pervasive patterns that I was seeing. So I was fortunate enough, I was basically a service provider for a VC firm, A16Z, as they were looking at their portfolio companies and like in this blockchain digital asset space, we've heard for years that there isn't legal clarity. And in many aspects, there wasn't, but there's plenty that early stage companies could do to set a good foundation for governance, risk, and compliance. So I started doing that work. I've just sort of countless really fun projects. And I think that initial experience I've taken with me to working with you all at Stablecoin Standard, because as we know, we have some laws and regulations that have been proposed, but we don't have full, and I'll use air quotes, clarity on what stablecoins need to do to make sure that they're resilient and that they protect the users. But as probably your listeners will hear at the end of the podcast, I also think that one doesn't need legal clarity. There's plenty out there. In the same way, when I started in digital assets, I really didn't think one needed black and white to sort of innovate responsibly and do some really great projects. So thank you. That's my story.
And it's a good story, but also I think, you also have that unique perspective in that you're actually part of a stablecoin issuer. We both are a GMO Trust, so you have that insight from a legal perspective and a compliance perspective of how a highly regulated operator works and navigating those kind of challenges. And certainly there have been some over the last sort of 3 years before the air quotes clarity has come into the mix. It's been an interesting path that way. So it gives you some insight on that side.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, Sir Rami. And I'm going to laugh every time I say it. And I do think your listeners, like there's this convergence right now, hyper competition and convergence between banking and payment providers and sort of the new entrants on the stablecoin side. And having a couple of years under our belt as New York Department of Financial Services regulated stablecoin issuer, we really do have a unique perspective. There's lots and lots of financial institutions, including banks, even community banks, that are super curious about like what this means as an opportunity, as well as making sure that their strategy understands from like an informed risk perspective. And having the DFS a couple of years sort of operating under that prudential regulation, I think is helpful, not just for the new regulations in the US, but also there's a lot of parity in Europe and Asia.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that. And yeah, I do like your phrase. I think I've used it over the last year or two, responsible innovation. I think that's really sort of the mindset. Stablecoins have come into favor outside of the crypto ecosystem now. Payments, me and Luther were just talking earlier today, payments is the hottest topic at the moment in crypto, and the amount of valuations that are happening to these things because of stablecoins. Why? Because these stablecoins live outside of the crypto ecosystem. They live in the real world. They're that product that brings that kind of all the advantages of the technology, but actually real world applications for people who have no intention of speculating on the crypto asset. It's a very different mindset, very different demographic, consumers, and therefore the vendors and the banks that are working to service those people now have a way of, they will only take responsible actors to be their service providers in this ecosystem. So that level of maturation that's happening over the last couple of years as people become more interested in stablecoins, it's sort of the reason why we're around as Stablecoin Standard, because we wanted there to be that forum. And, this is probably a good segue into how we got to the policy section and so on.
I think from a policy perspective, it is interesting, right? How the various regulations are being passed and how that's bringing more adoption. But on the flip side, now you have a plethora of stablecoins being issued. And how do you view that? So there wasn't enough activity. Now there is a little bit of clarity, with increasing clarity across the board. And then now you have the opposite, which is there's a ton of activity. And how do you see that from a policy perspective? Do you see that as a lot more noise there now? And now we need to kind of find the signal in the noise? Or do you see that as the natural evolution of a market?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of both, Luther, in that, right, we started 2025 with this sort of concept of it was going to be the year of the killer app, and the killer app was stablecoins. Now we're well into wrapping up Q4, and there is a lot of excitement. There are a lot of opportunities. But I do believe, and that's one of the reasons why our policy focus at the Stablecoin Standard and GMO Trust is a member and part of it. And it's really embedded not just in New York regulation, but globally, this standard, so that anyone that's interested in getting involved has some sort of milestone to do their own due diligence and figure out what's noise, what's hype, and what is sort of a capital S in stablecoins for stable and resilient, and sort of that informed risk management that I mentioned at the beginning. So I do think that stablecoins are and should be boring. They're the rails, they're the infrastructure. It's one of the real tangible use cases that those that are new to the space can really sort of wrap their hands around, improving global remittances for corporate treasury, things of that nature. So that is, genuine and authentic and exciting. But we're also developing standards for algorithmic or DeFi based stablecoins. There are also a lot of products out there that are branded as stablecoins, but if you were to measure them up against our standards or our new offering, which is the StableCheck transparency tool, you may do your own due diligence and be able to sort through, and there is some noise.
I love the way that you classified it. As exciting as stablecoins are, if they truly are the rails that we all expect them to be over time, you're absolutely right, Beth. They need to be as boring as possible in the way that they function. That's a very good way to encapsulate it. Go ahead, Rami.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree with this. And I think, the standards that I think we need to talk about the standards, but I think we need to talk about the work that Beth has done because of the international nature of the organization that we have founded. I think it gives us a unique insight into how we crafted those standards because, certainly with my day job, it's New York, very US-centric, but the nice thing about sort of the Stablecoin Standard was it was by definition an international forum, and we had people who were operating highly regulated stablecoins in a number of different jurisdictions, whether it be Singapore, Australia, UK, Europe. We had representation from a lot of subject matter experts or operators in those regions. So, we had that sort of perspective, global perspective, to see where the best practice fit was, and I think it's worth spending a few minutes just sort of discussing how the evolution of the policy that culminated into the first version of Stablecoin Standards, I think would be great from your perspective, Beth.
Sure. I don't want to bore the audience who are non-lawyers, but I'll give a little bit of an overview and you let me know if you want me to dig down deeper. And I'll explain the why, which I think is an important point for everyone just to be reminded of. So we started with a bottom-up analysis. We had some members and partners of Stablecoin Standard help us. So global law firms take all of the current and proposed laws, rules, regs, put them all in, and then figure out what the themes were. And despite a lot of global fractionalization, despite a lot of sort of protectionist concerns, we did see very easily some very common themes. We used those themes for the standards. Then when Genius was passed last summer, it was a really great time to do a reality check on whether that bottom-up process worked, because we expect over time we're going to evolve. And it did, because those themes were present in the Genius Act. We didn't need to change or adjust the standards for the Genius Act. And in some respects, the U.S. had an easier job than other jurisdictions because the U.S. law came afterwards. So sort of balancing innovation and resiliency. The last law, which would be the Genius Act, I know other jurisdictions like Hong Kong and others are continuing to innovate and do a good job. But when you see that balance, we were able to strike it pretty well. And I also think that, it's important to remind the audience that it's really hard to see the growth in stablecoins from my perspective if there is fractionalization. It has to be global. So if you have a DPEG of a stablecoin because the stablecoin wasn't prudentially regulated or it didn't have what it needed to in order to be resilient, it's very unlikely that it's going to be a local impact.
Yeah.
So this global, the global impact of blockchain and digital assets is the reason why our standards needed to be that bottom up. So I think about, you all know this, I've been working this week on a really large security issue, a big breach. Mm-hmm. And that just shows how globally, whether you're building or globally you're working in crisis management, when there is some sort of either product issue or fraud or theft, you need to have that global perspective. And I think we delivered that with the standards because we were able to sort of go shopping and pick the best of what we thought the regulators had proposed.
And I would say we also added a sense of neutrality because, from TradFi days, that different regions will generally try and set regulation that makes them a competitive environment to attract business. So, there's always been a historical regulatory arbitrage from people playing at the different places. But it's interesting because it's borderless money, but yet it's regulated in specific jurisdictions. So we needed to find somewhere neutral, and as a forum we were able to be that neutral venue that was able to shop around for the best legislation and the principles, see what worked in different jurisdictions and didn't, and then use that as the standard. And for anyone sort of listening, obviously these are on our website, stablecoinstandard.com/policy. There's a definition, and there's 3 real standards: operational resilience, transparency, and issuer and product commitments. And I'll let Beth, if you want to summarize them briefly, more than welcome to, or we can let people go and go to the site as to why we picked those 3.
Yeah, I do think it makes sense for people to go and take a look. They're very brief, and then to also take a look at the white paper, that not only the white paper, but our comment letter to U.S. Treasury about how stablecoins and the most novel reg tech providers are able to make sure that all of this excitement is sort of risk adjusted. So I think those 3 are good resources for your listeners to go and take a look at: the standards, the white paper for StableCheck, and then the Stablecoin Standards comment letter to U.S. Treasury about the novel reg tech providers, and how responsible innovation is, in some respects, even easier using the blockchain because of all of the transparency, as long as we get the security issue and the personal privacy issue right.
I think for us to just pause for a minute and look at this from a different lens, right? Like, if any one of us who got started into blockchain and digital assets, one of the most common themes that we often talked about forever and to this day is the decentralized nature of digital assets, right? But I think we all quickly realized, and this is really what Stablecoin Standard has been able to kind of draw a line in the sand with, is that although the assets work on decentralized networks, etc., because you have, like you said, Rami, you have this asset that traverses borders and really operates 24/7, you still needed a centralized or a cohesive way for everybody to agree that this is good and this is bad, right? And I think that nature of it is actually it takes a hard right turn from how we define the technology side of it, which is the decentralized nature of it. But then to your point, I think it completely makes sense why, we've had this and I've seen this in banking as a whole, if you guys remember from this perspective, which is one bank, even though they don't know the other bank, will say, if you're a customer of a bank in that other country, then we can trust that you've followed some guidelines that every bank in the world has adhered to it. Now the variation may differ a little bit, but a bank standard is a bank standard, whether you're in one country or the other. And I love what Beth, you've done from the policy perspective, and what Stablecoin Standard has done, which is laying down the common law for what a stablecoin should be, really, from that perspective, and then everybody kind of agreeing to that, right? And I kind of see this represented as well from the various ways that either MiCA is coming out, or Genius Act has come out, or something that Singapore is doing, etc. So it is very different from how decentralized things work, and then how central this needs to be.
Well, all right. I'm going to challenge you respectfully there, Luther.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mix it up a little bit for our podcast. I do think 2 things can be true, in that the stablecoin standards and all the work that's been done to date is really about CeFi, centralized finance. And there's a place and a time for that. But I still wholeheartedly believe in the ethos of decentralized finance and the need for it in certain situations, in certain jurisdictions. And as things evolve in certain jurisdictions where economies may not be stable, or governments may not be stable or resilient, or in a way in which the different citizens want to be able to have access to their own funds. That's one of the reasons why we've developed the DeFi standards, because I do think there's responsible innovation in the DeFi space as well. And what it may be is, if we were to look into the future a couple of years from now, just in the same way for traditional finance, you have a bank And then you have exemptions and exclusions, you have funds, you have trust companies, you have all different features that aren't fully regulated like a bank. I would imagine when you look at payments and digital money, we're going to have some that are within the CeFi world and others that are within the DeFi world that could also fit under the moniker of responsible innovation. It's one of the reasons why we're working on those standards as well.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, you're right. We start with CeFi because I think it was the lowest hanging fruit and probably the least controversial in terms of sort of engagement, and also where the issues were coming from, I think. But you're right. There clearly is a tension between decentralization, the ethos of decentralization, and everything it stands for. You know, the Bitcoin maximalists. Why did it come out of the GFC? It came as a antithesis, the solution for the failure of the current system. You know, the irony, I think we've said it a couple of times on podcasts before, the irony of sort of the success of stablecoins is this paradox, isn't it? You know, the best thing that we've been able to do on the blockchain, the most successful use case, is just a representation of the old system digitally, and we've improved a little bit, but it's still the same problem. So, yeah, I think that the next era is going to be sort of responsible innovation into this DeFi space. But I think also, you know, you mentioned it a bit earlier, Beth, in terms of setting the store for the principles-based approach that happened in setting the standards, the international perspective and the policy work that Stablecoin Standard was doing in terms of contribution to various response letters, writing letters to Treasury and stuff. We had been engaging on that, and I think, you know, you've set up a team of ambassadors, you know, and global ambassadors and things like this that can help us sort of channel that expertise. I wonder if you wanted to touch on those a little bit, and then I feel like we should probably spend a bit of time on StableCheck, because I'm really keen for people to understand the hard work that's gone in there and where we're heading next with that.
Sure. So I would say sort of a call to action if anyone wants to join, the more the merrier. But we are really fortunate that the ecosystem that has helped us do what we've done to date is just basically like an army of white hats or an army of volunteers that, and the expertise is very high. So we've been able to do a lot in a short amount of time that, from where I sit, is very strategic and very smart, because the depth of expertise is pretty deep. And as you had mentioned, we have ambassadors out of Asia, out of Europe, and we have tons of contributors in the US. So we are pretty fortunate, and we have been pretty busy on these projects, as we just mentioned. We're also very fortunate, as I sort of reflect back on the year, because we have an environment where we're much more, there's a lot more interaction with regulatory bodies and a lot more opportunities to share our perspectives for and on behalf of the stablecoin industry. So the ambassadors, all of the work that we do, all the volunteers, all the opportunities to really sort of educate and advocate for the industry. It's been an amazing year.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And I think, you know, we are getting more visible, I think, you know, in terms of reflecting and projecting some of that expertise on panels and in different forums and so on. And yeah, you're absolutely right. The level of sort of goodwill, ambassadorship and contributions from people who, you know, these are the heads of policies at major companies, and, you know, these are very senior people at top tier law firms and so on. So we're getting a lot of expertise that I feel that we have a great example in that, you know, a major company based their own criteria on our standards, which was fantastic. So it shows that it's got that intellectual rigor that helps it to get that sort of credibility with the regulators, and I think we're even getting regulators coming onto our policy calls. We had that a few months ago as well from the more progressive regulators. So it's good to see. I'm happy that we're going in the right direction.
The StableCheck conversation is the perfect segue, I think, at this point, right? Because that we need to kind of highlight how that is going to be setting the standard per se, right, from a stablecoin standard perspective. So please go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, so as I alluded to earlier, we announced a white paper at our annual event in October. It is on the website. So if anyone in the audience is doing due diligence and trying to sort through the quality based on operational resilience and some of the risk concepts that we mentioned, there's this white paper that has a short list. There's a couple of pillars and a couple of due diligence questions that will be used to either give 1, 2, or 3 stable checks, and that'll be on a dashboard on the website. But there's also a very qualitative list. So if you happen to be an institutional allocator and you're curious, there's basically a supplement that gives additional due diligence questions. I think one of the attributes that I'm most proud of is its simplicity. If you're someone that does due diligence, I think what you'll see is very familiar and very pragmatic approach as to how one does due diligence to figure out and check to make sure the stablecoin is what you think it is before you allocate a lot of funds to it. And then there will be a RegTech component to this over time. There's already been a partner, potentially, I think 2, Rami can correct me, where if you're also someone that's on the investment side and you want to have more data points about the activity within the stablecoin sector, you're going to have those sort of data points as well as the policy StableCheck review. Rami's point about neutrality, we carry that through, and that the preferred process is issuers voluntarily join the process. They answer the very simple due diligence questions. They provide evidence. And then a review board confirms and makes sure that the process makes sense. And then we post it on the website. There'll also be a path for stablecoin issuers that choose not to participate. But my hope, at least, is that that one is really used rarely and that the issuers submit the information. So the information we judge is accurate and fulsome and comes right from the source. And we're just an independent review of that and, the follow-up that might come. What did I forget, Rami?
I think you covered it. I think the beauty of it is in its simplicity. I think if you keep it simple and you stick to the main core principles, high quality assets, ability to redeem, the things that sort of permeate from the consistencies across global legislation as to what they think a good stablecoin is in practice, and the things that the regulators are highlighting. If we make sure that those things are in StableCheck and are recognizable and recordable, then this is the way that you improve, a rising tide lifts all boats. We can try and make sure that we can get the industry to have something neutral to sense check itself. But it goes to the point that you said earlier, both of you, which is that we're entering a region now or a period of time where stablecoins are hot. Everyone wants to issue a stablecoin. There's going to be a plethora of stablecoins around the world. Of course, mainly dollar denominated, but there will be other stablecoins of different denominations around the world. So anyone from a corporate side who needs to do due diligence could easily get lost in looking at how do I rank these stablecoins. We have run out of letters actually to put on the end of going to 5-letter stablecoins as the mnemonics, not 3 and 4. A tool like this a neutral tool is something that should be a bookmark, or certainly downloaded by any corporate or any financial institution, or potentially a regulator as well, who hasn't got regulation drafted yet, so that they can use that as the basis for at least the starting point of a sensible, robust due diligence process. I think that's sort of, in my mind, that was always the end for what's the outcome, who do we expect to use something like this? And it's sort of, this is for corporates, this is for regulators, this is for the general public as well. But, for institutions who might be allocating in size, they will certainly want to make sure that the products that they deal with meet the criteria and the basic benchmarks that the other financial products they use adhere to. So, it's an expectation, and it's just an assumption in TradFi. It's not the case in this part of the world, where sort of the convergence of technology is meeting the regulated world. We're at that intersection at the moment. So at the moment, the resources like this, I think, are very useful.
One of the things that we've often talked about in the past, Beth and Rami, is that not all stablecoins are the same. They're not the same, but also they meet different purposes, right? And so do you guys see StableCheck evolving to kind of have different classifications? Like you mentioned algorithmic stablecoins earlier, Beth, but do you guys see that the way that these things are evaluated, or the criteria, you having 3 or 4 different criteria, one for a certain kind of stablecoin, one, and do you guys see that being the next evolution of this?
I'll kick us off, and then I'd love to hear what Sir Rami thinks as well. I expect that, and I think that's the natural progression. So to me, you could go through the process, but really not be a stablecoin, right? So I think over time, you could be a different product, but not a stablecoin. And that in and of itself could still be helpful. So we have to do first things first. But I sort of mentioned digital money and payments. And I'm not convinced over time that there wouldn't be additional categories. We're really sort of building this for the people that need it. So I guess it would be my first request that as people go to the website, they look at our resources and they start to use it to continue the dialogue and let us know what's the most helpful.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think that, we're really early. I think there might have been a comedy phrase, Luther, that I used on the last podcast, which was, we're in the infancy of the maturity or something like this. So I think we had to start with the products that are most likely to hit the road with regards to mass adoption and hitting traditional non-crypto audience, consumers. That had to be centralized stablecoins in regulated environment. Where is it heading? Yeah, the reality is that more of life is going on chain. So I think decentralized stablecoins. I mean, I just popped up DeFi Llama just to have a look at the stablecoin sort of ecosystem at the moment. After the main incumbents, USDT, USDC, the third one is Athena, which arguably, we could have our discussions about that. Some would say it's a structured product and maybe not even a stable coin, but, maybe that's a discussion for another day. But after that, there's Sky, Dollar, and DAI. So these are both certainly decentralized stable coins. So, but their market caps are very big when they're talking multi-billion market caps. So they're relevant in the financial system, the on-chain financial system. So, and I know that they have aspirations to get wider application in the traditional world. So I think it's inevitable that we will expand the framework so that it can encompass a wider nature of stablecoin products, So I think we do head that way. Also think, commodity-backed stablecoins, I think, are quite interesting, on a personal basis. Gold-backed stablecoins, silver-backed, precious metal-backed stablecoins, I think, are interesting, particularly regionally. So I'm interested to see how they develop, and again, incorporating our StableCheck and our standards to accommodate commodity-based stablecoins, I think would be quite interesting. So I think that's where I'd like it to head. But you've heard from me and Beth. Luther, what do you think? What should we do?
It's very interesting because There's two ways that I think about this. One is absolutely there's going to be an evolution, right? Like we've even debated like tokenized deposits, which is a very different animal, right? But from stable coins, the different kinds of stable coins, etc. And I think there's definitely going to have to be some kind of boxes that we kind of draw around these things, just that can be adopted on a global scale, right? So again, common language, common understanding, leads to better adoption. I think we all agree from that perspective. The other side of this is also, I think it goes from being a certification or a standardization to a standard that educates new entrants into the market, right? So I think there's an education piece here that comes out of this. So it's because, it's one of those things, right? Like if you, when you show up, you go to take a class in college or uni or whatever, and then you do the exam. Well, the education piece was there. You're testing what you learned. And I think as we're kind of evolving StableCheck and laying down some of these guidelines and policies, I think also the other thing that'll happen is newer entrants would possibly look at this and say, okay, I need to kind of build it to that standard. So let me get educated on how the standards works. What do I need to kind of have? Like, what are the SOPs that I need to have in order to meet that? So I feel like that's the other evolution of this that we will see, is that it no longer just becomes like a test to be a litmus test to meet, but a standard that actually educates people on how to build and release a better stable asset, or some kind of asset of that sort. Beth?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I think that, arguably it's actually the better business development move, because if you build your product to a particular jurisdiction's regulatory requirements, you're potentially limiting yourself for global expansion, and that might need you to restart the process. By incorporating a global framework that already has harmonized the core elements and told you what you need to do to give you a wider global application, you're more likely to then have a global distribution product. And as we said, ultimately stablecoins and digital money are borderless products now. So it's democratizing borderless value. I think actually raise another point which I'd love to speak about with Beth is on-chain money. It's not just stablecoins at the moment. There's tokenized deposit. There's various flavors, whether it's CBDCs, stablecoins, tokenized deposits, bank token. A question for Beth is, do you feel that we should be looking at those products and incorporating them within this? Do you think there's an evolution here in terms of it just becomes digital or on-chain money? Doesn't sound as cool as Stablecoin Standard, but it's sort of, with the fungibility between the two or the three different products there, I feel like in the next few years there'll be much interaction and much overlap between the various types of on-chain money. So I'm wondering, how do you reconcile that? Because if you just regulate or do best practice in a silo, that doesn't necessarily work if the product then jumps somewhere else, and then you have a bank can issue a stablecoin. We have at our event in London last month, we had the pleasure of a gentleman from SocGen, the SG Forge project, a euro-based stablecoin issued by a bank. But, everyone knows about JP Morgan's JPMD tokenized deposits. Citi has a token services product. There's lots of different routes that banks are taking, actually institutions are taking, to accommodate and incorporate these different products. So, from an industry body perspective, I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of, do you broaden the church to widen the product set? Do we broaden it in terms of the applicability of stablecoin? Do we assess the different things and to include these different flavors?
I'll give you a short answer and a longer answer. The short answer is, I hope so. If we're successful, that makes sense to me. A little bit of a longer answer is that these standards allow the early stage innovators to compete. Otherwise, it will just be going towards gravity of what you might know, or the examples that you just listed, which are the big banks that end up as stablecoin issuers. So the Stablecoin Standard, StableCheck, is allowing for competition and for new entrants to show that they really have done a good job and a thoughtful job in innovating and how they've done that. I think the last thing I would say is like the evolution potentially will depend on what is the highest demand or need. So for instance, right now we're focused on redeemability. Maybe over time that won't be as important as another attribute. But when I look as a corollary to traditional finance and certain products there, so if I'm going to put a product, a packaged product in a retirement account, and I look at some of the rankings and the data providers that we have, I always look at expense ratio. I have like a certain given, which is if I know the name and I know they're systemically stable, then I look at the returns and the expense ratio. And I care about the expense ratio because I think it's like a commoditized product. Arguably, stablecoins could be the same way. And maybe what the feature will not be this fear of depegging and redeemability. Maybe it'll be something else because like you think of the reserve fund, which was a money market fund that was not resilient during the credit crisis of 2008. And now I think when people decide which money market fund that they want to purchase, they're not focused on resiliency the way they might have been right around the credit crisis. So we may see that we adjust to what the need is. So not only would it be additional digital money products, but it also might be a different due diligence lens. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely get that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable that more money stays on chain, so redeemability therefore becomes less of a construct, or less of a mandatory thing. I do also think that technology.
Well, let me interrupt to say that, like, I think it's always important, but it might just become table stakes, and then we'll focus elsewhere. Yeah. But yeah. I want to make sure I don't say like it's not important because it is totally
important. No. It's fundamentally important. You are able to redeem, at par. That's just it should be a basic trust factor, But I think in terms of utility and what people use it for, maybe the expectation is that it won't go off chain. Value stays on chain, and therefore it's sort of other factors may come into play a bit more. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I wanted to ask you sort of, I guess, well, we have sort of talked about it. Sort of, we've been covering sort of where next, the evolution of sort of StableCheck, the evolution of policy. How do you see the role of policy within Stablecoin Standard developing? Where do you think it's heading? Is it again different products? Different audience? Where would you like it to head in 2026?
Again, I would give you two answers. The first answer is I really do expect and hope that the regulators will look at what we've done and there'll be more direct engagement as we talk about implementing regs and calibrating the different stablecoin laws, rules, and regulations that are already in the book. So increased ability to educate and advocate on behalf of the industry. And then the second answer, or the second point, as I look ahead to 2026, I do think we have an opportunity to talk about issues in this very chaotic and busy, just global moment, for us to pick a couple of strategic issues that are important for us to put some sunshine on. And I would say our comment letter to the U.S. Treasury in light of the Genius Act sort of articulated those issues. I would highlight them here and hope that we have more opportunities to talk about it and to help in that regime, which is the most important part when you're innovating, to me, is striking the balance between security, right? Because security hits redeemability, everything else in StableCheck or the standards. But is the blockchain secure as it can be? And are all the innovators doing everything they should be to make sure security is as strong as possible? Is one of the topics I would like to see that from a policy perspective, we separate it from sanctions and AML and KYC. It's not the same as security. And then the second issue is personal financial privacy. Sort of to get at Luther's point, I do think stablecoins can grow without requiring that every single user has to be KYC'd in the same way that fiat cash is used. And you do not need to be ID'd every time you use fiat cash. So I think those two issues are really fundamental for the growth. And I hope that we can help educate and advocate on those in the coming year.
That's actually very interesting. And this kind of harks back to something that you said earlier, Beth, which is there are instances where you guys are setting a standard, or we're setting a standard through Stablecoin Standard and the policy, and then ultimately StableCheck, which is the way to kind of identify good stablecoins. And I think it's interesting, right? There is a portion by which we're looking at existing regulation and then kind of setting a standard. There is a portion by which countries that potentially don't have a regulation are looking at this and saying this could be the standard or this should be the standard. But I think vice versa, could there be a world where by meeting the StableCheck standard or the StableCheck set by a stablecoin standard, is there a world where that would automatically get you the right level of SOPs, requirements, etc., right? Where you could say, I have met everything needed by MiCA and by Genius and by Singapore. So you kind of, by meeting this one standard, you're almost meeting like a global standard in the nature of it, right? And so now you know that that is the gold standard per se when it comes to stablecoins from that perspective, right? So I think that could be something very interesting. And the other thing that I look at this also is the fact that you said this earlier, Beth, which is, should it be more than just the stablecoin itself, right? It's more than the asset itself, but it's all about the organization as well, right? You mentioned funds, there's the Morningstar ratings for funds, etc., right? And so you look at that, they're evaluating the fund manager, right? What is their success ratio? How is this company operate as a whole, right? Because that could be an issue, right? So I think I see both those things happening, which is this becoming potentially a gold standard by which if you met that, you know that you are by and large good for the rest of the world's standards. And then the other thing is the standard itself set by Stablecoin Standard expands to more than just the asset itself, but it's also about the organization.
To take your second point first, Luther, we already do have in the standards and in StableCheck a more holistic look. So by way of example, I think it was the UK that came out front and had an attribute about the character of the management. So you'll see a qualitative sort of standard about management needs to have adequate experience and there needs to be some sort of code of conduct, because not only does that meet the requirements in that jurisdiction, but we think it's just, to use your phrase, like the gold standard globally. So there is some of that, but of course we're going to learn along the way and we're going to refine. And I love what you're thinking. To me, yes, I'm a possibility thinker as well. And I do envision, let's just say hypothetically, an issuer goes through the process, learns a lot and needs help. We're here and we can figure out a way in which we can advise and help. So this way, when you're done with the process, you've also remediated any kind of issues so that and there's lots of examples of this out in the world, but you go through the Stablecoin Standard process and then you're fit for purpose for your prudential regulator. That is the concept, very efficient and hopefully the process really does have an impact that is more than just the process.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense. And as we start to wrap up here, Beth, what are some things that you've noticed? We've talked about Stablecoin Standard. We've talked about StableCheck being something that really helps corporates, as you said, Rami, identify good stable assets, right, from good organizations. But where are some things that you see, Beth, that are still maybe some gaps in how stable assets in general are treated, used, viewed, etc., like from a policy perspective? What is it? What are you seeing from your seat?
I think we've talked a lot about the convergence of banking and the new entrants, and I think we're going to continue to see that. But one of the topics we didn't discuss, and I don't have any answers, but there's lots of controversy, and I would say is whether stablecoins can be yield bearing. So, is it the stable coin is just sticks with the peg and then another intermediary is the one that offers yield, or whether the stable coin itself can offer yield? And we know that there is a lot of discussion out there and a lot of confusion, misconceptions about yield when it comes to stable coins. I see Rami has something to say too.
It's a really interesting one because certainly in the jurisdiction that I'm in the UAE, Abu Dhabi, ADGM has a framework which allows for yield-bearing stablecoins, and Paxos, which is NYDFS regulated like ourselves, issued a yield-bearing stablecoin, USDL, in the center. So, we have precedent of forward-thinking regulators that did set that up. And certainly in the US, that's a fudge at the end of the day, in terms of the ability, the prohibition on stablecoin issuers to issue yield has been circumvented by giving rewards to partner companies to basically distribute the yield. So we're just basically, for me, that's an indication that maybe is not the optimal legislation that's out there if people are finding loopholes and going around the system to get that. Some would also say, Beth, we've had this conversation around choke points and bank protectionism and so on, that some would argue that Genius was drafted exactly for that purpose in order to protect deposit flight from banks and to protect the incumbents. So, that probably needs another podcast, I think. We probably need another hour to discuss that kind of stuff. But yeah, absolutely agree with you. But again, I bring it back to the exciting nature of Stablecoin Standard is that it's an international forum. And so this sort of lack of geocentrism that we have, we've got that international perspective is super important at a nascent stage of a product, certainly nascent stage of regulation, where we're able to sort of actually bring expertise from the different regions to show the different approaches, and that includes the approach to distribution of yield and yield-bearing stablecoins. Yeah, no, thank you very much for sort of bringing that point in. Yeah, we hadn't discussed that, but it's an important one to discuss. So yeah, I think we've probably hit our time. So I think we can start to wrap things up here. Beth, I found this an extremely insightful discussion. I really enjoyed it, and for me, it's a really sort of very personal thing as to how we sort of started Stablecoin Standard and the great work that you're doing and the team is doing. I'm very happy to see that sort of Stablecoin Standard is taking a global lead in promoting that education and best practices and, backing it up with output. There's Stablecoin Standard themselves, StableCheck, real products that regulators and the corporates and everyone alike can actually take to heart and actually use and implement in their world. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. And if you like this episode, check our previous talks with Eric and Ahmed from Kraken and WillPay, Nick Philpott, Zodia Markets, Edward from Zero Hash, Kevin Lignity from Boardless, Raj Parekh. It's really a who's who of the stablecoin world for more real world perspectives. So if you like what you've heard, subscribe, follow, do all the exciting things that you need to do, and we'll see you on the next episode.